Let me start by saying that my current role at Arizona State University is to help coordinate and launch a project on democracy and climate change, which identifies the longer term horizon, gets out of some of the current issues in American politics and global politics to look at where we have to be. We're entering what has been called a long emergency. There's no really quick fix to this, and it's a number of crises coming together that are not so much technological, although there are certainly technical aspects to them, as they are moral and political. So that's the start of the talk. Now, what I'd like to do is to put three things together: education, democracy, and global change. And for a young person, I've tried to think through, I'm no longer young. I let past that point long ago, but I'd like to, uh, I would like to try to see the future as young people may be seeing it. And it's not necessarily a pretty picture. So with that said, let me start with a few slides. Um, all of us share the fact that we were once children, and we carry that with us all of our lives. I'm impressed. The older I've gotten, the more I think I see childhood in all of us. Things that were inspirational, things that were once fresh and new and exciting, but the child in all of us. So that's the beginning point. We all, everywhere on the planet, share the fact that we were once children. Uh, One of my favorite educators, Maria Montessori, uh, described the way in which the child needs to shape his or her own future, and meaning the personhood. So, child's work is to create the person, as she put it, that she or he will become. That's their main objective through their play, their make believe, and through their incredible learning that takes place in those first 6 or 7 years. Um, Secondly, I want to clear a few things. One is that the disorder we see around us, we call it climate change or biodiversity crises or ocean acidification, but it reflects a prior disorder in how we think about the world and our values in shaping our perceptions. So the ecological crisis is really one of mind. And what that means for all of us in education is education isn't some uh, eighth item on a long list of things that we must do. It really is the top of the list. It's the core issue that has got to be resolved. In that standard, all education, everything that we do in all departments is environmental education. So by what we include or exclude, we teach young people that they're part of or apart from creation. Now, growing up young, I think is harder than it once used to be. And so I want to mention a couple, two things in particular that I think that are great obstacles to young people's future. In the States, I'm told, on average, in a given day, a person will be exposed to something like 5,000 advertisements per day. And that comes in logos on ball caps or billboards or advertising that pop up on your computer screen. But a good bit of this owes back to the work of Edward Bernays, who was a nephew of Sigmund Freud. And Bernays, at the dawn of the 20th century, began to understand how we are shaped by how you can shape people's mindsets and their thinking, including their politics and their political thinking, by appealing to the id. And so Uncle Sigmund's breaking up of the human psychology into ego, superego, and id. You don't appeal to the superego or the ego. That's the rational or idealistic mind. You appeal to the id. And so he learned early on how to sell cars as a matter of selling sexual potency to males. And very famously, he got women to smoke by making cigarettes, as he called it, little torches of freedom. So as women learned to smoke in the early 20th century, they were declaring their independence from men. Perniciously, Bernays began to see and explore the idea that you can engineer consent. And he called it the very essence of the democratic process, which is, of course, an oxymoron. But the way that you shape the public dialogue through advertising brings people in or out of the democratic process. But it was a process, as he saw it, as an advertiser, of manipulation. Here's four curves. They're known all over the world. They originated, for the most part, in the United States. Coca-Cola, McDonald's, hamburgers, Nike, swoosh. But the fourth curve, I once said, is the one that could kill us. Somebody in the audience yelled out, no, all four can kill you. That fourth curve is, of course, the Keeling curve. David Keeling, who went to Mauna Loa in Hawaii, the Hawaiian chain, in 1959 to measure carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so that curve has emblazoned itself on the scientific debate now. And it's only gone up. When Keeling went to Mauna Loa in 1959, the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was about 315 parts per million. Yesterday, it was measured by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration at about 413 parts per million, going up about 2.5 parts per million per year. So we've swamped young people in this advertising world. That's a scene from London. Two of my favorite advertisements, which are so indicative, are or three. This one, hear the ground, or hear that, it's the ground whimpering. And you wonder, why would anybody want to make the ground whimper? And then there's this one, the rear end of a Hummer made by General Motors. And the tagline here is, when the asteroid hits and civilization crumbles, you'll be ready. And you want to ask, ready for what? This thing gets 8 feet per gallon. What are you ready to do? But that's not the point. The point is not to be logical, but to be manipulative and to appeal to that level of the id, the male need for dominance or control, or the woman's need for whatever. This is Dolce & Gabbana, and I honestly don't know what Dolce & Gabbana sell, but I gather they're in sustainable agriculture by the looks of the picture here with the chicken and so forth. So you have a couple of free-range chicks selling something in the barn. But again, the appeal is to the id. The appeal is not to any kind of rational thinking. So 5,000 advertisements a day. Now think of it, if you're an educator, you compete with advertising. This goes on nonstop all day long, every day of the week. You have students for maybe a few minutes in a classroom, or an hour, or perhaps if you have them all day at an elementary school, but your time with them is measured in a few selected moments. This is every day, all year long. And then all of you have seen pictures like this. These are kids looking at cell phones. And Einstein had some thoughts about that when the technology surpasses our human skill and intelligence, we'll have a generation of idiots on our hand. And I think that is a plausible thing perhaps to discuss. But the point being that we drive young people down away from the consideration of the large things in life, politics or human survival or climate change or our relationships to each other. This is the famous triangle by the psychologist Abraham Maslow. And the point being of advertising is to drive people down to infantile self-gratification, keep them in a state of infancy and dependence and perhaps addiction. And so from early ages, young people, and more so in the States than in Norway, young people are exposed to advertising that make them very dependable and very dependent consumers for a lifetime. Here's a second obstacle. And along with Bernays, in the 20th century, we experimented with ways to indoctrinate people politically. And so one question one can ask is, how did the Germany of Luther and Bach and Goethe, Beethoven, Humboldt, and Schiller descend into the moral abyss of Hitler, Himmler, Goebbels, and Auschwitz? And I want to say very clearly, I don't think this was just a German phenomenon. I think it was latent in a good bit of the modern paradigm. My question, could it happen here, is directed at the United States, and there I think we're playing out a scenario presently to see how far fascism can go in the United States. Rennie Liefenstahl, a brilliant filmmaker, did a film on Adolf Hitler called The Triumph of Will. And it was one of these masterpieces. You can still see it if you go on YouTube or other venues for films. You can still see this thing. It's a very powerful film. But what she was aiming to do was to use the power of film to indoctrinate and propagandize, starting at the Nuremberg Nazi Party rallies in 1934. This is the rally grounds at about that time. It is still there. The columns here have been all removed, but you can go there when you're in Nuremberg. You can see this, and many of you, I'm sure, have been there. This is what it looked like in Leni Riefenstahl's film. She put these giant searchlights up into the sky with Hitler on the podium right here, haranguing the audience, and out here were thousands and thousands of German believers about to be fed into the slaughterhouse of World War II. And then the propaganda efforts. Hitler, it wasn't just the use of media to propagandize, it was a society-wide effort that started with very young children and with women and changing the gender roles as society went on. But the propaganda was firm, and young males in particular who needed male approval swarmed into Hitler's lair here, so to speak, and it became a major part of the Nazi takeover. And again, I say I want to repeat that I don't think this is just a German phenomenon. I think it's present in the United States and perhaps somewhat implicit in all efforts of modernization. But the takeover of Germany by the Nazis was largely a takeover of how they thought. It wasn't just a matter of force. It was a matter of changing mindsets. Victor Klemperer, who survived World War II, he was a student of language, wrote a book in the mid-1950s called The Language of the Third Reich. And he describes in one part of the book encountering a friend of his before the war who had become a Nazi and served in the army. And on meeting Klemperer in April or thereabouts of 1945, when Germany lay in ruins and most of Europe was in ruins, 65 million people had died. And he said, I believed in him, but I still believe in him. I always will, and I really do. So Nazism was accepted as a gospel because it appropriated the language of the Gospels, according to Klemperer, but it also was part of a larger educational effort. And I think we learn between advertising and the experience of fascism how manipulable the human mind is and how easy it is to distort well-meaning people into all kinds of mischief. Coming to the United States, we are experiencing the kind of the ongoing effort at insurrection here, and democracy here hangs by something like perhaps a slender thread. This one I put in as a joke. The beautiful poetry of Donald Trump has yet to be written and probably won't be written. But the crisis of democracy has a long history. Democracy in Athens, it didn't begin in Athens. It has long origins that go back into tribal societies in South Asia and so forth. But in the Western world, it began very largely in this area that we call the agora or the marketplace. Socrates' trial was someplace right in here. He was in prison someplace over here, but these were the corridors of the streets that he walked, and where many of the ideas that we take now for granted as part of Western tradition were experimented. But Thucydides, in his book, The Peloponnesian War, describes something that still reads a good bit like the headline, certainly in the United States and in parts of Europe. The war gave both sides a ready chance to invoke outside help in order to injure their opponents and gain power. Words changed their ordinary meanings. Impulsive rashness was held to be the mark of a man. The cause of all these evils is love of power and due to ambition and greed. And there was no reconciling force, no promise binding, no oath that inspired awe. Inferior minds were, as a rule, the more successful. So Thucydides, a long time ago, recognized some of the vulnerability of democratic societies. And this was, I think, in many ways characteristic of American society presently. Is democracy dying? Well, I think there are good reasons to think that perhaps it is dying. It is certainly imperiled. There's a rash of books by historians in the United States and in Europe and elsewhere about how democracies die and documenting the threat the democratic societies face. And of course, the irony of any democracy is that people can choose to end democracy. That can be a choice that's made democratically. Across the world, we see this rise in what's called the democratic recession. It isn't just in Europe and the United States, but it's across in all democratic societies to one degree or another. The Economist in 2018 had the United States as a flawed democracy. You here in Norway are doing much better. Later in the index in 2020, they still had the United States as a flawed democracy, backsliding. A report that came out from a think tank in Sweden 2 days ago describes the United States as a backsliding democracy. That's from the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. The causes are many, and I won't take time to go into causes, but part of it is represented in this slide. The development of an autocracy, which, as Aristotle wrote 2 millennia or more ago, aristocracy or plutocracy can destroy democracy. It simply buys it out. In the United States, with a few billionaires that have more wealth than the bottom half or 2/3 of the country, are part of a European and worldwide trend toward massive control and concentration of wealth. There's another factor here that we had not counted on in thinking about democracy. It's the way in which foreign countries can intervene in the political affairs of current democracies. And we all do it. The United States is not innocent in this. But the internet and Facebook and so forth have opened up ways in which democracies can become vulnerable to other societies. There's a question in the United States which I think deserves to be answered, and that is simply, can democracies survive Facebook and social media? And this represents a major challenge for what we call in our constitutional law the First Amendment, which guarantees freedom of speech and association and so forth. But what we've discovered is that Facebook and social media generally open up, if they're not regulated or controlled in some fashion, opens up a sewer of hatred and animosity and misinformation and lies. And how we escape from this and still be a democracy, I think that's a question that deserves to be asked. In the States, this is the January 6th insurrection crowd. Maybe 10,000 people came. Most all of them had been badly informed, opinions inflamed, misinformation and lies led them to the Capitol. We're still sorting through this a year later. We'll be sorting through this, I think, for a long time, and we're not through this insurrectionary period. The United States, I think democracy here hangs by a fairly slender thread. The people here are still there, they're still out there, and there are forces that are taking us toward a darker place than I wish we were. That's the Confederate flag from the previous insurgency of 1861 to 1865. That flag was carried by a man walking through the Capitol on January 6th. How do we get out of this? There's some questions, and I want to end in just a few minutes on that, but I think it's time to begin to address the paradigm that we have built in our politics. The Mont Pelerin Society began in 1947 with Frederick Hayek and Milton Friedman, these two, and a group of economists who met in Mont Pelerin in Switzerland to talk about the way in which we could avoid authoritarianism. And basically, the long story short, it was to essentially turn things over to a market society because governments could not be trusted with power. So their idea we now labeled neoliberalism, which just means the dominant of market mechanisms to decide fundamental things. So if you want roads in a society, the government doesn't do that. You would have private contractors do it because there happens to be a way to make a profit. At about the same time, Karl Polanyi wrote a book called The Great Transformation. He was in America at the time he wrote the book, but he saw what lay ahead, and I think what we can now see in a neoliberal society that basically, as he put it, it is the demolition of society by turning everything over to the market. Ayn Rand, an author, Russian emigre to the United States, wrote a book that is very popular in the right-wing circles, which essentially says that not just the market should decide how things happen and why they happen, but also dominant men, the great people, the kind of people like Elon Musk and so forth. And so she prized that kind of titanic leader that would tower over the common people. A whole philosophy developed around this called objectivism, but it took quite a hold on the right wing of American politics. So in the United States, I think there's good reason to wonder whether you could create a solar-powered, sustainable, efficient, resilient, fascist society. And by fascist society, I mean one, as I explained below there, dominated by military, police, corporations, banks, the top 1%, racial persecution, closed borders, violence, mendacity, and climate denial. Is a solar-powered, sustainable, fascist society possible? And I think the answer is yes. And I think it might even be the default setting of where we're going. And so I think there's a case to be made, which I'll try to describe briefly in just a moment, for democracy, not for fascism or some kind of technocracy. But let me get into something called the Great Transition. There's been a work of a number of people in various places around the world to describe what this Great Transition means. How do we get out of the mess? And I want to begin by just characterizing it in these terms. And this is a very sketchy description. For one thing, the predicament we're in is a long emergency. There's no quick fix to it. This is a mashup of a number of issues. They're partly ecological, partly social, partly matters of justice, partly matters of organizations and institutions outliving their usefulness. But this is a long emergency, and there is unfortunately no quick fix to this. Now, I hasten to add, this is not a statement against technology. It's simply to say that the most important issues on the future have to do with politics and values, not with technology. The scale is global, and all of us know this, but we don't have global institutions that work at a sufficient scale or power to deal with the issues at hand. COP26 in Glasgow was a case in point. What the world needs right now is some kind of global agreement. We needed it decades ago. Went to the Copenhagen meeting some years back, previous COP meeting, and we needed something even that far back or further back. The first warning to a US president was made by the National Academy of Sciences in 1965. And we still have no de jure climate policy or legally binding climate policy in the United States, and certainly nothing in the world. Third point is we're already an overshoot. We're already taking more from the planet than ecosystems and the biosphere can provide. And then, as all of us know, when you begin to unpack these issues. These are incredibly complex, what are called wicked problems. Again, there are multiple problems. It's very easy to try to solve one and then create unwittingly a secondary or third problem. And the last point here is that they're primarily, in my judgment, moral issues, not first and foremost technological. They're moral issues with technological aspects. So if we were to if we had some miracle way to ask our great or great grandchildren, what would they want us to do? This list, I think, is a short list. I think they'd want much more than this, but they would, I think, and I'll explain this in a moment, to fix our democracy. I think they would want to live in a democracy. And that means restoring civility and rationality to our debate. More so, much more so in the United States than I think in Norway. They'd want to repair the ecological damage, which to the extent that it can be, some of the damage will not be repaired in a time scale that's meaningful to us. But the part of the damage that can be repaired, they would want us to repair. They want us, I think, to recalibrate or adjust the scale of humankind, including our economy, to what can be sustained by the biosphere within it, all of its limits. They'd want to run the world on solar power and keep fossil fuels in the ground. They'd want a demilitarized world and a world without nuclear weapons. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. They'd want to adjust our paradigms and philosophy so that they accorded with the thinking of people like Arne Naess and philosophers who've thought about, and scientists who've thought about the way the Earth works as a physical system. So if you take how the Earth works as a physical system, how would we then now begin to construct a civilization that accords with the way Earth works physically? I think they want us to defend public language, those words that we hold in common and in trust, that describe the highest and best aspirations, words like justice and fairness. I think they would want fairness within and across generations. And then I think they would want us to give them practical reasons for hope. And I want to come back to that at the end. I wrote once that hope is a verb with sleeves rolled up. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in just a minute. I think Greta Thunberg put it right. They would want us to tell the truth about our situation and what can be done about it, and then roll our sleeves up and get to work to build the best that we can. This is James Hansen, the famous American climate scientist. And he said something I think that is quite true. It's very hard to see us fixing the climate until we first fix our democracy. And it raises an issue of, is democracy worth saving? Shoshana Zuboff, who is the author of a wonderful book called Surveillance Capitalism, says it's the one idea to have emerged from a long story of human oppression that insists upon people's inalienable right to rule themselves, to decide how they're ruled, by whom, and to what purpose. C.S. Lewis, the English writer, once said that he was himself unfit to rule even in a hen house. So the real reason, he put it, for democracy is not that we're so great, but that mankind is so fallen that no man, be it Donald Trump or an Adolf Hitler or anyone else, can be trusted with unchecked power over fellow men. Here's the number of charts that were put out in an article on the Anthropocene. You've all seen these. The age of exuberance, somebody once called this, but all of the charts are showing everything going up. And in our time, particularly the atmospheric accumulation of carbon dioxide or nitric oxides or methane and so forth, but all these are exponentially up. It leaves us with an incredible governing problem. How do we govern human affairs when human affairs are so intrusive and destructive of natural systems? So this is the famous chart. If this could be part of, let's say, an airplane cockpit control panel, you'd have good reason to worry a great deal if this popped up on your screen as a pilot. We're in overshoot in a number of areas. There's some areas, for example, we don't really know, for example, the chemical pollution or its effects on human health and ecosystems. This is the famous Keeling curve. And again, as of yesterday, the parts per million were just a tad over 415 parts per million, but this curve is relentlessly moving upward. I put this in just because this is what we can't do. We're limited now to, if we want to keep Earth's temperature at something below 2 degrees centigrade, we don't have much more time, and there is not much more we can actually burn. So in a matter of a decade, a very short period of time as these things go, we have to sequester a lot of oil, coal, and natural gas. So effectively, we have to take something like $20 trillion or a bit more off the books as an asset and make that simply non-existent, zero out that part of our accounting system. And this is a slide I've used, or two slides I've used, aimed at primarily American audiences. The United States has the largest military budget, larger than the next 11 countries after us. We have to begin to make a transition away from militarization of our foreign policy and militarization of world politics. Pope Francis put it, our sales, overseas sales for military equipment to places like Saudi Arabia and so forth, is simply money that is drenched in blood, as he put it. But the demilitarization and denuclearization of the world is a high priority. I think young people looking back, our great-great-grandchildren, would want us. And this, again, is aimed primarily at the United States. I did want civil dialogue. This is a meeting that we held here in Oberlin a couple of years back. This is Arnold Schwarzenegger, the actor. This is Tom Steyer, the billionaire. This is a guy from an Oberlin graduate from, at that time, U.S. News and World Report, part of Time magazine. But civil dialogue of a former Republican governor and a Democratic billionaire. We showed in a number of things in that gathering that we can come together around civil dialogue again. And in the process, begin to protect these words. What does patriotism really mean against the global backdrop of our ailments? What does it mean to be conservative relative to climate change? How can climate deniers call themselves conservative? We need to understand what liberalism really means and think through what it has done for us and begin to rethink both liberalism and conservatism. We need to think of politics as a noble profession, leadership and so forth, and government as a good thing, a necessary thing, not just a burden that we have to carry. It can do good for people, but it needs constant vigilance and constant transparency in public service and so forth. And in the United States, much more so than in all the Scandinavian countries. The burden of taxation, which a U.S. Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes many years ago said it was the price we pay for civilization, but the rights and responsibilities, and then the need for all of us to pay our fair share of taxation. I'm going to let George Orwell slip past here, but George Orwell described very importantly how if you want to take over a country or corrupt a country's government or its democracy, you corrupt its language first. Here's political philosophy. This applies much more so in the United States and perhaps in the United Kingdom. Thomas Jefferson, in 1790, wrote a passage that the earth belongs in use to the living. The dead have neither rights nor powers over it. That was a pretty radical statement at the time. Edmund Burke, the British political philosopher, Irish by birth, but served in Parliament, describes society as a partnership not only between those who are living, but those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are yet to be born. Now, between these two statements, there is a strong similarity. Jefferson is a person of the extreme left. Burke, a man of the extreme right. Can the left and the right come together around a political philosophy that in fact accords with the way Earth works physically and the demands of justice and fairness in society? Burke also made this note for people who are conservative. Men are qualified for civil liberty in exact proportion to their disposition to put moral chains upon their own appetites. Think back to the advertising. All of that advertising that we were exposed to continually is to encourage us to spend, to want more and have more. It's ordained in the eternal constitution of things that men of intemperate minds cannot be free. Their passions forge their fetters. What we know to be liberalism in the United States, and this again is aimed more at American audiences, but liberalism has given us a lot of good things, from public education and child labor laws to arms control and international laws, and lots more. This no longer can be simply a swear word in American political life. This is William Barber, and he attended this is a conference. You can see the letter on the behind him, the State of American Democracy, which is a project that we're now taking to Arizona State University and to a network of universities around. Barber is, I think, the best speaker, the most eloquent speaker in the United States. And he said at the event that we held in 2017, a line that really stuck out with me: our ideas are too puny for our circumstances. We have to learn to think in moral terms and as systems thinkers. How do things fit together? Those words, whole, holism, and healthy, they're all linked, and we have to begin to understand how far the Western world has frayed or strayed away from understanding things in their wholeness and over longer periods of time. Now, I want to come to the conclusion of my remarks in saying this. I think young people want us now, will want us more and more to give them things to do. This is the Adam Joseph Lewis Center that we built on the Oberlin College campus. It was a project that I was honored to lead and raise money for and so forth. What we did on this project was to pull about 250 students together with an incredible design team. This was designed in the 1990s, and it became the first entirely solar-powered building on a U.S. college campus. This part of the building to the right of the screen, this is the wastewater treatment system. So it's drinking water in, drinking water out, uses no toxic materials. This was designed and built just before there was a U.S. lead building rating system. And about 250 students worked in various parts on this project. The philosophy of hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. We wanted to give them a chance to roll up their sleeves. So this reduced virtually all of the environmental issues. How do you power civilization? How do you grow food? There are gardens in the back of the building. How do you use materials differently? How do you begin to create a different civilization in the context of a 14,200 square foot building? And then we did the same thing, again, using students in a 105,000 square foot building, also entirely powered by sunshine. This is the Gateway Center at Oberlin. It's a hotel and conference facility. This is platinum rated by the U.S. Green Building rating system, entirely solar powered. So as educators, I think we need to give young people a chance to work on projects like this, projects that require them to think through how they eat and how they travel and how they're housed and fed. It doesn't have to be all buildings by any means, but to engage their talents and creativity. And it allows them to see a different world. Something like 70% of our sensory apparatus is in our eyes or connected through vision. And so what we see has a very powerful resonance with us. And so all the work you've done in Norway and the Scandinavian countries to power your societies by wind and solar power and build different buildings and much more cohesive cities is important, because that is the reality that we then see. I want to end with Albert Einstein, and I think that this is a great way to end. Our task, as he put it, must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circles of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. And so I'll end there and just open up to any questions or comments or thoughts that you all may have. Thank you very much for listening.